Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So with no more ado, it is a real pleasure to introduce to you today to Bill McKibben, who we know to many of you, I think, through his writings, which have crossed the Atlantic very effectively. I remember first hearing about him through the book The End of Nature, which came out in 1989. Without going through the whole biographical details, the one that struck me was the Boston Globe in 2010 called him probably the nation's leading environmentalist. I think that's a Heineken moment. They actually really remember this guy is seriously good, and you ought to buy his books. He's also well known not just for being an excellent writer, and he's written widely, not just in his books, but in various magazines and journals as well, but as an activist, as someone who actually gets down to doing the stuff as well. Most notably through the 350.org organisation, through which he organised what's been described as the largest ever global coordinated rally of any kind, with 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. I didn't even know there were 181 countries. That's a lot of countries, a lot of demonstrations. So it suggests, good organisational and inspirational skills as well. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome you today, Bill McKibben. Thank you.
Well, what a pleasure to be here. It was very kind of the organizers to assemble all my favorite people in the UK in one place for me to get to talk to, and especially to see Satish emerge grinning through the fog this morning. I knew I was in exactly the right place. It's perhaps more fun for me than for you. Y'all are better at this kind of thing than I am. I'm a sort of low-end academic, if at all, and a bottom-end theologian, having never risen higher in the Methodist hierarchy than Sunday school teacher, so I'm not quite sure what y'all are going to learn from me, but I will do my best. You'll notice that I'm speaking without PowerPoint. I apologize for that, I guess. It's just kind of when I say something dumb, to also have it appear in large letters. So I will use sort of low-carbon virtual PowerPoint. And if it works correctly, sometimes the pictures will just pop into your head. This topic that we're about is of enormous importance, maybe central importance. And I'm to talk for a little while today about sustainable consumption, and I guess by contrast, unsustainable. And I want to just begin by saying, it's worth noting, as the kind of background for this, that we live in, sort of uniquely among human beings for the last 30 or 40 years in some of the places where we live in what has got to be the kind of ultimate flowering of a high consumer society, unlike that which humans have experienced before. And its benefits are obvious and often listed by its acolytes and exponents. And they usually begin with things like the fact that people live longer now than they did in the past. And in fact, longer life expectancy more than anything else is held out as the justification for all the occasionally admitted problems that also go with this kind of regime. And it's worth noting those benefits, and it's also worth noting that they're often tied to earlier periods in this consumer society. In fact, most of the increases in things like life expectancy that we see came in the latter parts of the 19th and earlier parts of the 20th century, when we learned and implemented very basic things about public health and sanitation and so on. And now, even those gains are very much in doubt. In the U.S., for instance, large parts of the country are now seeing life expectancy fall. And they're seeing it fall, among other reasons, for the fact that we have consumed ourselves in such a great, we've consumed in such a great frenzy that we have become actually rather larger than just in physical terms it's healthy to be. And that's beginning to see a decline in those good things. The point I'm trying to make here is just to break us out for a little while of the dichotomy, the idea that it's either have a consumer society or have some other thing, usually thought of as more primitive and backward. And I think that that's the wrong way to think about this. Like many other things, this is a threshold problem, not a binary problem. It's not choosing yes or no consumer society, it's choosing how far along that spectrum we want to go. And so since I live in a college town, the metaphor that comes to mind, and one that I'm afraid I used yesterday on the big Christian radio show in the UK, and perhaps may have shocked the presenter a little bit, but the thing that always strikes me this time of year as school is beginning at the college near my house is that the freshmen who are arriving are exposed to many things, sometimes for the first time, and one of them often is beer in large quantities. And they quickly discover that one or two of them, one or two beers makes them feel happy. And then the next weekend, they figure logically that must mean that 22 beers will make them that much happier. And someplace along that spectrum, they discover that there is a threshold past which beer has the precisely opposite effect. And so it is for many things, I think. That's a way of saying what I'm going to say today applies more to the societies of the West that are far along this consumer development curve. But it also applies to those places that are now entering or applies incrementally to those places entering the steep part of that curve. So I'm thinking about places like China, where I've spent a lot of time in the last few years. Urban China is starting to look a lot like parts of the West. Rural China still bears very little relationship to it. So depending on where one is on those curves, these remarks have more or less appropriateness. Here's the basic point I wish to make. That consumption in the West has passed that, whatever point, tipping point that is, and become, at the scale that it's currently going on, counterproductive. It no longer is producing benefit, at least it's not producing benefit enough to outweigh the harm that it is producing, and I want to look at 4 areas. The first, and the one on which I'll spend actually the least time, though it's been my life's work, is the ecological. I'll spend the least time because in many ways it's the most obvious and requires the least comment. But we could talk about it for a very long time, but suffice it to say that the widespread use of fossil fuel, which after all is what more than anything else undergirds the consumer society in which we live, has now produced change. We're no longer talking about theoretical change someplace in the distance, but we're talking about massive and ongoing change on a scale that no human being has ever seen. Sometime in the last 10 or 15 years, we've left behind the Holocene, the period of benign climatic stability that underwrote the rise of civilization, and moved into something else not nearly as nice. And the only question is how far into that future we're going to move. And at the moment, it looks like we're going to move quite a ways into it. Just the most basic physical indicators of the world around us give you an idea of how far out of balance we've become. Seawater is about 30% more acid than it was 30 years ago because its chemistry changes as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. The atmosphere itself is about 4% wetter than it was 40 years ago, which is an astonishing change in a basic physical parameter that hadn't budged for 2,000 years. That's because warm air holds more water vapor than cold. And as a result, we see massive increases both in drought, because we're getting more evaporation in arid places, and in downpour and deluge and flood, because the average residence time for water vapor in the atmosphere is less than a week. What goes up does come down, and it increasingly comes down in destructive and impossible volumes. Even the most basic gross indicators, like the way the world looks when you view it from far away, have changed in dramatic ways. I see a few other people in this room, like me, old enough to remember when those first pictures came back from Apollo 8 of our planet, drifting in beautiful blue-white splendor amidst the black void of space. Those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture is. The planet is about 40% less ice in the summer up top than it did then. Arctic sea ice having melted at a rapid rate. We can talk at great length about all the effects on people and societies of these kind of changes, and perhaps we will. For the moment, just let it be said that the first marker of counterproductivity of our consumer society is that basic effect on ecology. I'll leave that behind for the moment. The second one, which also carries, obviously, certainly ecological upheaval on that scale calls into question our willingness to follow God's request on the very first page of the good book that we exercise careful dominion over this planet to which we've been given the keys. Also of ethical concern is the second one, which is that at the scale we're now approaching it, this economy that we've built is generating inequality at massive, massive levels. And that inequality seems to be a feature, not a bug, as the software engineers would say. It seems inherent in what we're doing at the moment. There was new data published last week in the States showing that since 1983, wages and income for the bottom 80% of the population have actually fallen. It's not just that they're not increasing as fast as the people at the top. It's that more than 100% of the gains that our economy has been making have been aggregating to the very top end of the scale, and everybody else has been seeing not just their share, but their actual, not just their relative share, but their actual contents of their pay package decrease. And that widening of inequality turns out to be a problem not just in terms of fairness, but also in very practical ways. Some of you are aware of the work that's been done in the last few years on what inequality does to outcomes, the ways that it tends to increase stress dramatically with ruinous effects for, among other things, people's physical health. And that ruin, oddly, seems to occur to some degree at both ends of the scale of inequality. It's not particularly healthy or nice even for people who are doing well in these worlds to be living in them. But of course, the most difficult and devastating effects are for people at the bottom end of that scale. It wasn't always thus, and that's the reason that I keep making this point about thresholds instead of binary choices between a consumer society and something else. For the first 30 years after World War II, in fact, economic growth and the high consumer society managed to generate more equality than inequality as those divisions narrowed instead of widened. But past some threshold, clearly the opposite effect begins to kick in. The third thing that's being generated at the moment by the particular scale of our economy is instability. Again, a relatively new phenomenon. For a while, the growth of Western consumer economies generated stability. It tended to smooth out the traditional problems that went with boom and bust cycles, bad harvests, good harvests. We, figured out ways to hedge much of that risk and generate a certain amount of stability. But that's no longer the case, and you can of course see it in its ugliest form by that instability with some of the stuff that Anne was talking about last night. The collapse of our financial system in 2008 was clearly the result of instability brought on by size. The most important phrase to come out of that period was the idea that things had become too big to fail. And that meant, in practical terms, right at the moment, that therefore we were expected to bail out those things that were too big to fail and repair their losses. But in some larger sense, anything that's too big to fail is obviously too big and needs to be made smaller to avoid that kind of lacerating instability. And the idea that it was only or even mainly our financial sector that falls into that category is, I'm afraid, wishful thinking. We have other institutional arrangements that in the end are probably even more important and are also greatly oversized, top-heavy, vulnerable, brittle. Look at, as a complement to big finance, look at big agriculture and try to figure out whether it's a good idea or not to have put literally all our eggs, not to mention corn and wheat and everything else, in that particular basket. It's beginning to generate all kinds of problems, especially in light of the first thing we discussed, the ecological changes now on display around the planet. Our ability to continue growing the supplies of food on a planet whose population continues to grow is called into question in ways that it never has been before. In fact, the amount of grain produced on this planet per capita has been going down now for almost 15 years. And it's inherent, I think, in the arrangements of big agriculture that this instability is in play in a way that it's never has been before. When you have as much production concentrated in as few places and as few hands and in as few genetic varieties as we now do, the stage is set for all kinds of trouble, and trouble on a very large scale. The same kind of instability that marks big capital and big agriculture is also on display in the other most important sector in our world, big energy. It's enormously clear at this point that one of the things driving the kind of whiplashing economic cycles that we're seeing is our constant reliance on a globally traded pool of energy that comes from a very few places. Every time we start to crawl out of any economic hole that we're in, the price of oil immediately jumps up back above $100 a barrel, and when it does, it sends all our other economic arrangements tumbling again, making it very, very difficult to make any kind of progress doing this. And that instability is a function, of many ways, of the scale and centralization of those markets, of the fact that we're all relying on the same basic pool of energy. So, ecological counterproductivity, rise of inequality, rise of a new kind of instability that we haven't encountered in the past. And fourth, and again, this was alluded to last night in very good, interesting ways, but I think it's worth saying because it sets us up for maybe a happier ending. The other thing that's been on the rise in the last few decades of our particular consumer society is, oddly enough, a certain satisfaction. Oddly enough, because you would think that a economic regime as theoretically devoted as ours is to each of our own centrality and happiness would be producing sort of transports of ecstasy all the time. And if you think about it, well, I mean, the most interesting thing to understand is that that turns out not to be true. In the States, which is always the leading indicator of these kind of things, having progressed more rationally down each path than any other country on earth, one of the big polling firms has asked Americans each year since the end of World War II if they are happy with their lives, which is a very bottom line and basic question. The percentage of Americans who say, I'm very happy with my life, peaks in 1956 and goes downhill since then. If you think about it in the terms that we're used to thinking about it, that's very odd. Our standard of living in the United States has trebled since 1956. Okay? And, I mean, you know, there are appliances to do jobs that people hadn't even thought of as jobs in 1956. There you can go to the supermarket and get food that from all over the world, things that you never could have. You can take vacations to places that hardly even were on atlases. And if you have the right equipment, as we all do, you can download virtually any vaguely musical sound emitted anywhere on the planet almost instantly. You know, we should be in a state of rapture, but that we are not, is an indication that there's something more complicated along this spectrum. And I think that thing we're beginning to understand and isolate from the data. And what it is that past a certain point, high consumption generates, among other things, a lack of connections, a severing of connections between human beings and communities that erodes basic human pleasures and satisfactions. And I want to make the point again that that's along a spectrum. So if you're in rural China, okay, and you're living 10 people in a small room, which is not at all uncommon in my experience, acquiring enough extra capital to build another room next to that where you can live with your spouse and your child is an improvement. You have some privacy. You're able to think for yourself a little bit. You're out of the constant melee and scrum of overcrowded life. You begin to acquire a little stability and security, you know, so on and so forth. But the idea that automatically extends on up this linear scale just proves to be wrong. At some point, and we've long since passed it, at least in the States, what happens is that you move people so far apart physically that they're no longer in connection. Most of the prosperity that Americans enjoyed in the wake of World War II, and in much of the rest of the world too, has been devoted to one project, and that project was building bigger houses farther apart from each other. Okay? The suburbanization of America sopped up most of the money that, I mean, we spent money on military adventurism and so on and so forth, but most of it went to that particular project. A project that came obviously with sort of ecological ruin attached to it. You needed a lot of energy to heat and cool and move between these big houses. But that also came with a certain kind of social ruin attached to it past a certain point. And this is an almost physical calculation, just sort of Brownian motion, you know. The odds of running into other people in the course of a day decrease as you get further and further and further apart. And indeed, that is what has happened. The average American eats meals with friends and family half as often as they did in the 1950s. The average American has half as many close friends as they did in the 1950s. My guess is that the results for Britain would be following in that wake. I don't know if anybody has the data or not, but my guess is that it's moved in that direction, if not to that extent. That's a very large change, half as many friends in 50 years. for a socially evolved primate to undergo. And it's no wonder that it's not leaving us particularly happy. There just aren't enough iPods in the world to make up for that kind of change. One of the problems, of course, is that even as we start to recognize this, and there is an intuitive understanding of our sort of loneliness, in a sense, it becomes very difficult to restore this balance, because it turns out that sociability is a talent like others, and that it erodes with lack of practice. And so it becomes difficult, even if one hears an exceptional sermon about the need for community and things, to act on it when you've lost those particular skills. At the height of the housing boom in the States, before it turned to ruin, a real estate reporter for the New York Times asked an excellent question in print one day, which was, what's actually in all those houses, you know, the size of high schools now appearing across the American landscape? And one of the answers was that increasingly they were being built, and not just the very biggest ones, you know, much sort of upper-end housing, all the kind of starter castles for entry-level monarchs that were across the landscape, were being built with two master bedrooms. So, you know, the husband snores, the wife pulls away the blankets. The American, anyway, answer to this problem was to add 600 or 700 square feet to the house, which obviously had ecological implications, but just was basically sad. I mean, the idea that people were hunkered down in their own caves, staring out across the hall at their mate, you know, was disturbing at best. These four things, the ecological, the damage, the inequality, the instability, and this loss of happiness, or as an economist might say, a sort of declining utility of this extra consumption, should be of interest to us, not just in, it should be of interest to us in ethical as well as practical terms. All of them, for reasons that are easy for you to figure out, present a dramatic ethical challenge. Now, how to respond to this sort of change? One of the best things about being in this century is that we have the last century behind us, and we've learned a few things from it, right? Had we been here 40 or 50 years ago, there would have been a number of people arguing that the way out of this was through a kind of centrally planned socialist economy of some kind. And I imagine there are fewer people willing to make that argument now, because experience demonstrates that on at least, really on all the accounts that I've described above, huge centrally planned Marxist economies are just about as bad as the ones that the sort of consumer economies were in at the moment. They managed to generate ecological damage, inequality, instability, and unhappiness as well, and sometimes they managed to generate them in even larger quantities. Instead, it seems to me that the thing we should be worrying about less is sort of ideological formation. I'm pretty sure we're going to have markets in some respect or another going forward. The thing we should be worrying about, the variable we should be worried about, is less ideology than it is scale. It seems to me that scale has become the paramount variable. It's not that our arrangements are too big to fail, it's that they're too big to succeed in any of the ways that we want them to. The fixation that is on growth, on making our current systems larger, is no longer useful because they've become not just big enough, but too big. And a set of policies that would head us in a different direction and try to figure out how to build down some of that scale might be the most useful thing that we could be engaged in now. You've already heard of two of the most important of those policies last night from Ann and from Paul. Clearly, one is the regulation of capital markets in ways that restrain what's just a completely pointless froth and churning at the top of end of all of this. The thing that's making investment bankers ever richer and everyone else ever poorer. And the second thing is regulation of the price of carbon. Because at the bottom of a consumer society, our consumer society anyway, it is, at its bottom, far more than any ideology or anything else, is the endless availability of cheap fossil fuel. That's what made us into consumers. Keynes once tried to figure out how much the average standard of living had grown in the 2,000 years up till 1800. Okay? And his calculations indicated that it was possible, just possible, that the average human standard of living might have come close to doubling over that 2,000-year period. But it's, so the change had been infinitesimal in our terms. And that's because over that 2,000 years, we really didn't learn anything, how to do anything new. We already knew about agriculture. We had, sails and wheels and banks and all of that stretching back far into, really into prehistory. It was when we learned how to do this new thing that involved burning coal and gas and oil that life changed. And it changed because suddenly everybody who had access to that had a few thousand slaves, as it were, at their beck and call. And that's what produced the kind of surpluses we now see in the power of a consumer society. And so any regulation that managed to restrain the availability of cheap fossil fuel would have enormous effects, wider effects than just about anything else that we could do. It's instructive in this regard to compare the post-war experience of Western Europe and of the United States. Okay? Though Western Europe has followed in many ways in the footsteps of the U.S. down this path, it hasn't followed as far. And hence you see coming out of Western Europe less ecological damage. They're not pouring as much carbon into the atmosphere as Americans and Canadians and Australians are. Less inequality, though it too is increasing. Maybe not less instability. At this point, global markets are so tied together that instability spreads like a virus in all directions. And the class of people who are investment bankers are the most internationalized, global, and stateless people that have ever been produced. But somewhat less of this unhappiness, decline in utility that I was describing when we do surveys about who's happy with their lives. Europeans actually score considerably higher than Americans do on those results. We've tended to attribute this to different ideological arrangements, subtly different ecological arrangements that place more emphasis on social welfare in Western Europe. And that in a sense may be true, but it may be secondary to the simple effect that in most of Europe, we kept the price of fossil fuel high after World War II. And the result of that has been a different set of physical arrangements. European cities have tended to blossom and have a kind of centripetal pull in, as opposed to the endless centrifugal spinning out across America into suburbs. Obviously, people have privatized life to somewhat smaller degree, partly because simply the availability of the greatest agent of that privatization, the individual automobile, was less in a place where gasoline was $8 a gallon on average for many, many years. I raise that only to show that there are real and powerful effects that come with fairly small changes in conditions, in variables, because some of those conditions, and in particular the endless availability of cheap fossil fuel, are so important for what the future looks like. We could go farther down this path if we began to think, I think, in very specific terms, very explicit terms, that our goal was to try and reduce scale somewhat. And if we were able to get around what's in many ways a psychological barrier that keeps us from thinking about things other than growth. Growth has always been a particularly attractive thing for humans to think about, at least for the last couple of hundred years in our economy, because it has a clear analog in our own lives. We went through a period of growth, and it was exciting and rewarding and interesting. We like seeing it in our children. It makes real sense. Other things don't really have that same kind of analog. I think one of the most unfortunate words in the English language in certain ways is sustainability. It really has no, I mean, we can strive to give it some kind of meaning, but in fact it has no analog exactly in our experience. And the word that we're really striving for has something that is more like maturity, that maturation, that bittersweet point in a human life when we decide that growth in physical size having come to an end, we need to figure out other interesting ways in which to go. And it is bittersweet, and it's worth recognizing that. That's the price of adulthood for individuals and also for societies. If we began down that path, then we would start to understand that there are other goals we could explicitly be aiming for instead of putting all public policy to the goal of expansion and growth, as it really is at the moment. No matter what else we say, that's what our institutions are set up to produce. There are other goals that turn out to be as important that we could prioritize in the same way. Security, that is stability, resilience, durability, fellowship. These are all things that we could explicitly aim policy at producing. And if we did, my analysis suggests we'd be better off because these are things that our consumer society is no longer generating in useful quantities. It's sort of the same way that at some point in the life of an individual, you stop worrying in your financial life about growth and accumulation and more about preservation of what you have, you know, maintenance, durability, resilience. These become higher goals. What's interesting is to see that this is starting to happen in parts of our economic life, even in the absence of explicit policy choices. And I think it's starting to happen simply because the logic of it is getting so overwhelming. And I'll talk for a minute about the place where in my country it's most obvious, and that's been what's happened in our food sector in the last 15 years or so. After the very, very, very long period of centralization, consolidation, and industrialization of our food supply, there's been something of a backlash. There have been people who've been working hard to promote this for a long time. Chief among them, the most important, the most beautiful, for my money, the most beautiful writer in America, and certainly our greatest ethical thinker, Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky farmer and essayist and novelist and poet, who've been for many, many years talking about the need for a renewed, among other things, local food system. That was preaching into the wind for several decades, but sometime about 15 years ago, it really began to catch hold. And since then, the number of, say, farmers markets in the U.S. doubled and then doubled and then doubled again. It's been the fastest growing part of our food sector now for a decade. And it's grown to the point that it's having real effects on the landscape. The U.S. Department of Agriculture said last year that for the first time in 150 years, there were more farms in America instead of fewer. Okay? That's a very amazing change in what had been by far the most important demographic trend in a century and a half, really almost since the end of the Civil War in American life. Okay? That trend has bottomed out and reversed, and it's all because there are many more people coming in at the lower end, smaller scale end of farming in order to do this sort of new thing. This has good effects in a number of ways. I mean, look, ecologically, the tomato that travels 5 miles is superior to the one that travels 5,000 miles. Right? Culinarily, also, I traveled 5,000 miles yesterday. I know what I feel like. That's what the tomato feels like. But the most interesting effect, and the most important in many ways, is the social effect of this change. A farmer's market is a different social construct than a supermarket. A couple of years ago, a pair of sociologists followed shoppers, first around the supermarket, then around the farmer's market. You all have been to the supermarket, you know how it works. You enter, you fall into a light fluorescent trance, you visit the stations of the cross around the perimeter of the market, and you emerge. When they followed shoppers around the farmer's market, they were having, on average, 10 times more conversations per visit. Okay? Not 10% more, 10 times more. They were doing the work, as it were, knitting back together some of that lost social connection that 50 years of high-consuming society had built up. That's very, very important work, and it's a kind of necessary work if we're ever going to have the political and, one of the reasons for our political powerlessness in the States and for the problems that we've wandered into is that 3/4 of Americans no longer know their next-door neighbor. All right? They may know their name or whatever, but they have no relationship with them. That is a very new moment in human history, and it's a recipe for human powerlessness. And it's good to have any institutions that are starting to change that. And one can see how that same logic is spreading to other sectors at the same time. We talked before about energy. The logic of the energy world that we're moving towards will be to replace centralized fossil fuel production of power. Fossil fuel is very rich in BTUs, it's very concentrated in a few places, and it's easy to transport. Hence, its logic was to build a few huge power stations and connect the rest of us up. What comes next, sun and wind, by their own logic, are exactly the opposite, omnipresent but diffuse. And hence, it makes far more sense to have what the engineers now call distributed generation. Solar panels on as many rooftops as possible, all linked together in some way. A farmer's market in electrons, as it were, for instance. So that's not only possible, but happening. And it's possible to imagine capital starting to follow the same trends. I've been writing in recent years about a lot of experiments going on in the States and elsewhere in that regard. They're still in their infancy in many ways, but the rise of things like local currencies in place after place is at the very least a symptom of our discomfort with the financial arrangements we've got at the moment, and at best a real alternative to that. It was remarkable to watch what didn't happen in the financial crisis crash in the States. What didn't happen was that the smallest banks and the most local ones around the country emerged largely unscathed from the whole thing. Because they were still at a place where they were capable of assessing whether or not loans made sense. They actually knew the people to whom they were loaning the money and understood what it would be used for and so on and so forth. A wise policy would be to allow and encourage encourage this change to happen gradually over time. That's how human beings best adapt to things, if they move slowly and gradually with less trauma and wear and tear. That would therefore be a wise policy. Unfortunately, a wiser policy at this point would be to go in an all-out sprint in the same direction. And the reason is that physics and chemistry aren't leaving us the 50 or 60 or 70-year window that would be nice in order to make this change in as untraumatic and human a way as possible. To get back to where we began, the window from climate change is closing fast enough that unless we really sprint to try and rearrange our lives, we're going to be overtaken by that collapsing wave. What do I mean? Let me give you just one example. Vermont, in the states where I live, is the best case example of kind of local food systems, certainly in the country and in some ways in the Western world. This is where much of this work began. It's been beautiful to watch. It's entirely possible, as I did some years ago as an experiment, to eat nothing that didn't originate in Vermont and keep you and your family happily fed for a year, okay? It's quite remarkable. But 3 weeks ago, at the tail end of Hurricane Irene, that storm that had come up the east coast of the United States encountered water off New York and New Jersey that was warmer than seawater had ever been measured at those latitudes before. And that allowed that storm to pick up huge amounts of moisture. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's this brute essential physical fact of this century. And it brought that water into Vermont and it dumped it there. We had set new rainfall records in place after place. Now, you know, rainfall records in a place like Vermont are 200 years old. You know, we have good data going back day after day, year after year for 200 years. That means that when records fall, they should fall very rarely, and they should fall by, you know, a millimeter or two when they do. We were seeing town after town after town that got 25, 30% more rain in a day than had ever fallen before. Okay? The proof of that was that Vermont's beautiful covered bridges, many of which have happily been there for 200 years, taking everything nature threw at them, a number of them were washed right away down rivers. And if you have a, you know, statistics freak, you can watch it all on YouTube. That rain was falling on a different planet than those bridges had been built on, than our road network had grown up on. Even though it's a heavily forested place, there's simply no way to hold back those volumes of water. And here's the kicker, one of the things that they washed away were a great many of our best showpiece examples of this local agricultural movement. The Intervale Farm in Burlington, 120 acres of nonprofit land in the middle of our largest city, that is a kind of training school for farmers. There are 10 farms there, and people come and have them for 3 years and learn from people around them and develop markets. And that 120 acres provides about 10% of the fresh food that our largest city eats. It's a great incubator, a kind of battery. Well, it's on the floodplain of the Winooski River, and every single thing in it washed away 3 weeks ago. There will be no harvest of any kind there this year, and in fact, a fair amount of the great topsoil there washed away too. On and on and on across the state. The point I'm trying to make is that you can have the most beautifully designed local agricultural system, say, in the world, and if it rains 30% more than it ever rained before, or if, as is currently going on in, say, Texas or the Horn of Africa, it doesn't rain at all for month after month, then you're still not going to grow anything. And hence, if we're to have any hope of getting ahead of this bottom line basic physical damage that we're doing to the planet, we're going to have to move more swiftly than would otherwise be recommended. We're going to have to make change at a pace that will be difficult at best for our systems and economies and societies to tolerate. We're going to have to change political arrangements and economic arrangements at least as quickly as we changed our technological ones in the last century, and that will cause all kinds of stress, and it may not be possible. It's just possible that we won't be able to make those changes. The wild card, and here I will end, and one of the things that gives me a certain amount of hope that we might be able to make those shifts quickly. The one real change in the last period has been the advent of the internet, which comes with many different effects, and some of them pernicious and so on, and some of them really quite interesting. And one of them is a change in scale, where before we had a centralized flow of information out from a few central places. Now we have, in essence, a farmer's market in ideas, as well as in carrots or electrons or whatever else we're thinking about. People can bring in, take information away. One of the things that makes possible to imagine is a world in which we live far more local economic lives than we do at the moment, where we really live our lives in a particular place without having to suffer what was always the biggest drawback of that world, which is the stifling parochialism that can mark small and local places. It's now possible to imagine living your whole life in the ambit of, within a small ambit, but still having constantly a window open to the larger world so that old prejudices can flow out and new ideas can flow in. If we're very smart indeed, we'll figure out how to take some advantage of that opening to make this kind of transition that I'm describing happen as quickly as possible. The basic thrust of what I've been saying has an underlying ethical dimension. And that is that a high consumer society works to, or at least professes to work to, making each one of us as individuals the center of the world. Okay? I did an odd book some years ago where I found the largest cable TV system in the world, which at the time was in Fairfax, Virginia, and it had 100 channels. And I got people to tape for me those 100 channels, and for one day, so I had 2,400 hours worth of videotape, and I repaired to my home deep in the woods and spent a year watching it. And I could speak much more clearly before then than I can now. But there were many sort of things that came out of that experience of trying to understand the world as viewed through that lens. But the most important was that the high consumer society we built, of which TV is one of the central anchors, but so the suburb and the shopping mall and things like that as well. Its constant refrain is that you are the most important thing that there could possibly be. You're the heaviest object in the known universe, and all should orbit around you. This turns out to be, for all the reasons I've described, ecologically problematic, economically problematic, produces a lot of, but it also should be, for all of us, ethically and religiously problematic as well. The idea of the elevation of each of us to that position of deity is probably helps explain why consumer societies have been so corrosive to faith among all else. And hence, it makes real sense to pay close attention as this conference is doing to these questions, and to begin to figure out how to back away just as fast as we possibly can. That transition will be, as I've said, extremely difficult, but it is the work to which we are called, and we need to figure out how not just to talk about it, but how to do it, and do it as quickly as we can. So I will end there. Thank you all.
and witty presentation. We now have around half an hour for questions and discussion. As with last night, could you please begin by saying your name and affiliation if you have one, and let's keep the ball rolling from the front.
Hi, my name's Ben White, and I'm working at Faraday Institute in External Communications. Thanks very much for the presentation. Just wanted to squeeze in two elements of, I suppose, something that's related. Both in your presentation, but also, I suppose, more widely in discussions on consumer society, sustainability, both in a Christian context, which I'm familiar with, and also in a secular context too. I find it very rare for people to use the capitalism word or to talk about class structure, for example. And I was wondering why you feel that that is often kind of specifically not mentioned in those terms when the discussion is being held.
So, my guess is that it's the experience of the 20th century that I was kind of alluding to. Because our general idea is, or was, that there was something called capitalism and the alternative was something called communism, and that the 20th century had made it clear that however imperfect capitalism was, communism was a deeply more imperfect idea that took less account of human nature, of ecological reality, of everything else, and attempted to substitute sort of pure ideology for any kind of common sense. And that's good. I mean, that's one of the benefits of being alive now, is we can cross off the list one of the possibilities for what we might do otherwise and start thinking about other ways of going about it. But it also meant that with the fall of communism, there was a kind of triumphal capitalism that emerged. And it's that triumphal capitalism that, more than anything else, is what I was sort of responding to. The idea that capitalism was such a great and powerful thing, that markets were so wise and august that they were going to make all necessary decisions by themselves. Okay? And so that's the direction in which, under Reagan and Thatcher and whatever else, we quickly moved. And it turns out that's just doesn't, I mean, one of the lessons of the late 20th century by now should be that doesn't really work either. And it doesn't work for a number of reasons, including all the ones that I described. And hence we need to figure out yet again some set of alternatives. My guess is that those alternatives are going to be at some level capitalist, in that they use markets to distribute goods, all right? That just proves to be a useful and efficient way of doing things, but that they're not, and they can't be, laissez-faire capitalist in the way that we're used to describing it, because left to its own devices, capitalism generates the series of problems that I described. And hence we're going to need to do what all adults need to do, which is regulate our behavior, figure out how to govern that behavior instead of just assuming that somehow following each impulse that comes into our mind will turn out to be productive in the end. And I think that's clearly where we are. And the fight now is between the people, the 95% of people who are being severely damaged by the sort of whiplash, those four elements of trouble from capitalism, high consumer capitalism that I was describing, and the 5% of people who still think that they're benefiting profoundly from them, the richest people in the world, who may not yet have quite figured out that they're losing their souls in the process, and who have the political wherewithal and economic clout to defend their position pretty adeptly. So I'm, for instance, deeply involved in the fight around fossil fuel right now. And our problem is mostly that the sheer economic concentration of power after 50 years of doing this in the hands of the fossil fuel industry is so great that it's able to work the political process, and hence we have to overcome it, not mostly through the application of obvious scientific logic. The planet's being destroyed. That should be enough, you know, that scientists are explaining exactly what the problem is. Now we're also having to go to jail and do whatever else, find alternative currencies in which to work, I guess is one way to say it.
Yes.
Just to follow this up. Communism, capitalism. Is there any other word you can suggest? You wrote end of nature. How about naturism? Putting nature in the center rather than still following market at the center.
Sure.
And what about non-violent democratic socialism?
Sure.
That could be another idea.
All of these are good, Satish. My sense is that our change in the change is less likely to be made by ideological conversion followed by a new set of physical arrangements than reverse. My sense is we're going to need to start changing our physical arrangements, and then as we do, that will produce a new sets of castes of mind. Okay, so when you have a farmer's market, all right, which is in response to perceived set of needs. Your food tastes bad and it's not reliable in its supply and it's bad for you and all the other things that have come with, you know, high consumer food supply. When you have that farmer's market and then everybody's seeing each other all the time and they're there and so forth, they're beginning to almost without knowing it, produce a kind of ideology of localness and community and fellowship that will be important going forward. I'm less persuaded, though I am a writer, of the utility of preaching about things and hoping that people will change as a result of that preaching. It strikes me that it's what we do every day in our lives that determines who we are, and hence there's much to be said for trying to change the arrangements that govern what those days. So, for my money, more important than any ideology I can think, you know, any sort of ideological shift I can imagine really, would be a 30% tax on the amount of carbon, on the price of carbon in fossil fuels, and that would produce a series of changes in our perception of who we are and what we want that would ripple out in really profound ways. But it's a very good point.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very interesting at the beginning that you identified yourself as a Methodist. I'm too from the Methodist tradition. I spent the last year kind of immersed in Wesleyan political ethics. And when you were speaking about the need for small, interconnected communities, there was a word that jumped out at me, and that was connectionalism, which is, of course, very important to our tradition. And my question to you would be, how has this idea of connectionalism informed your own political ideals and views? And do you think it's something that could have a wider application in our society?
That's a very interesting question, and I confess probably less than it should, or at least if so by osmosis, not application of brain power. In the States, the Methodist Church is the kind of rural. I mean, the reason I'm a Methodist is I was baptized Presbyterian and things, but in rural America, it tends to be the available flavor, you know, and so I've spent my life in rural America, and that's what we have. But the that connectionalism is very, very interesting, and the kind of when we think of Methodists in the States, we think of the circuit riding preacher, okay, and which is a sort of early, you know, proto-internet of its own, you know, at some level. So I imagine it is influenced in some way like that. There's a strong connection of localism, I think, you know, not the kind of, less the sort of Catholic sense of the great mass of humanity, and more the sense of discrete local nodes connected through, through what are now largely failing, at least in the States. I mean, connectionalism really doesn't work that well anymore. When we try to do organizing in churches, we now find it almost impossible to go through any denominational structure, because the denominational structures, A, are so weak, and B, spend their entire, as far as I can tell, all of their energy discussing the question of homosexuality, which apparently is the, one would think from a distance occupied roughly 90% of the Bible was a discussion of homosexuality. And so we now go through individual congregations more and more, and it's a shame to see that connectionalism kind of breaking down. There, in certain ways, it is.
Mark Charles with Keel. Hope you find one of your closing remarks. I just a comment on the internet is now quite a large entity user, specifically for video streaming. But the question is, sustainable production, the rhetoric of moderation and technology has been there since, say for example, Agenda 21 in 1992. But the research and practice is all on technology. Nothing about moderating our consumption. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is ideological and it needs to be challenged. The best thought that I have of how this could be challenged is religious organisations and leaders do already make comment about this, but I think there needs to be a collective process where I pray that the ECC meeting next month will be an opportunity for that. But if that were to happen, would that, from your perspective, be sufficient to challenge the oil barons, the coal barons, the gas barons, for example? If all the world religious leaders got together in the ECC next month and said, we've got to do something about consumerism, would anything change?
If all the world's religious leaders got together at a CC and said we have to change something of the consumerism, it wouldn't have hardly any effect at all. What will have effect is if they actually go and figure out how to build political movements that reflect that and that do something like that, which is entirely possible. I'll tell you a story. When we, every religious denomination that I know of has some positions paper someplace about how global warming is a bad idea, okay? And it, is bad for creation or whatever else. And none of these amount to much more than the piece of paper that they're written on. The act of drawing up declarations and charters and everything else so beloved of people in sort of our position is a sign of weakness, not of strength, okay? It no longer, if it ever did, produces actual change, I think. What does produce change is actual political involvement in the hurly-burly. The story I'll tell you was, we were doing, Tim was trying to talk about our terrific organizing ability at 350.org to pull off all these thousands of demonstrations. We just came through another weekend, last weekend, where we had many, many thousands of rallies in pretty much every country but North Korea. But it's not because of our incredible organizing. We had at the beginning, basically still do, a staff of 7 or 8 people in their early 20s who do all this work. So they're not organizing it. We're doing it. Here's a Methodist metaphor. We're organizing potluck suppers. In the U.S. anyway, that's kind of the Methodist sacrament. That's what we do. We set the time and the date and get people to help. Well, one of the best helpers we had right at the beginning, and my favorite cleric in many ways, was Bartholomew, patriarch of the Eastern Church, leader of 400 million Eastern Christians. And 2 weeks before our first big 350.org global day, he gave a sermon that he sent out through all of his, and instead of gassing on for a very long time about, this and that and whatever, he said, and I quote, "Global warming is a sin, and 350 is an act of redemption." Period, end of sentence. And that helped us organize enormously across that part of the world. And the Dalai Lama did the same thing in his part of the world. And we had enormous success with a number of imams in the Muslim world saying the same kind of thing and telling people, we're not going to write this on paper, that's not our point. We need you out 2 weeks from now on Saturday at noon at such and such a place building a political movement about this. And it was enormously useful when we were having this first big civil disobedience thing and the biggest civil disobedience action in the U.S. in 4 decades that I organized at the end of August. It was enormously useful to have a number of clerics say, not this would be this is in line with Lutheran social teaching, but we have a bus coming from our church at on such a day, and we're delivering 25 people who will go straight to jail with you. Okay, that's what we need at this point from the world of faith leaders. And so the more pointed and explicit and tough their critique is, the more useful it will be. The more couched in the language of official documents and consensus points of view and whatever, the less useful it will be. That's just my judgment.
Yes, I'm looking around this year.
Hi, Claire Brighton, Watnell Abbey until just this last Friday. Now I know if it's about. Many people have talked about a carbon tax. To my mind, that makes me slightly worried because it lets nuclear in, which isn't localised. It's not a human scale technology. And Bill, you've talked a lot about the farmers' markets working at grassroots, really just getting on with it. And you're talking about the need for a sprint now. And I'm just trying to get my head around how we accelerate to a sprint. And the different roles of governments, churches, other concerned folk. I'm just thinking about, is there a role for, should governments be looking at subsidiarity, so pushing decisions down to as local a level as possible, and at the local level, churches and parishes and so on. What should the balance be between the sort of social action that you've been talking about and just getting on with living exemplar lives?
So we have it's a very good question, and it's a very unusual situation. Global warming is the first really global problem that we ever faced. Even nuclear proliferation was basically confined to a few countries and so on and so forth. And it can only be solved by billions of changes in billions of households around the world. And so all those changes are very important, and we all should be at work doing them, and if you haven't changed out your light bulbs and things, shame on you, and get to it, But simply mathematically, there's no way to make those changes, to get the scale of change we need in the time we need in a kind of additive process. You change your household and convince your next door neighbor to do the same, and his brother-in-law then follows suit, and so on and so forth. To do the change we're going to have to do in the time we have, we're going to have to work by multiplication, all right? And that means politics and policy. So I'm always telling people, since, just by nature, it makes sense to spend a lot of your energy and attention trying to get your own local situation in order. That's where you are. But you need to spare a lot of your energy, extra energy, 20, 30%, whatever it is, for working at a national and a global level too. Because if we can't get those shifts like a change in the price of carbon at the biggest level, then we have no chance. As for nuclear, I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's just too expensive to be that, you know, it's just not going to be a big part of what we do because we don't have the money to do it. And one of the things that's interesting and important about trying to set up a system that privileges local changes is that you're able often to do things that are kind of frugal at the same time. Frugality has been the least, you know, the virtue most eroded by a high consumer society. But it's one that we should return to. We tend to think of it as a kind of antique baggage of our theology in certain ways. But frugality is an actually very powerful and interesting fulcrum in our individual and social lives. And it'll be interesting to watching that thing flourish once more.
We could talk about simplicity as well.
Yeah, simplicity is probably a better word.
Thank you, Bill. From Kingston, I don't have any particular affiliation. I'd like to think I'm a human being. Bill, you mentioned going to jail, and that kind of conversation between Christians here is very rare and very scary for many. And yet, the more I think about our situation, the urgency of it, and the more I've dealt with politicians over the years, my conclusion is that we are just not listened to unless we take actions which will obstruct, will change. Just before I came here, I read the book Deep Green Resistance by McVeigh, Lear, and Jensen. The first time I read their stuff, I was quite shocked. Not by their analysis, which is very much like your analysis, but by their willingness to move on to violent demonstrations against infrastructure. And that has all kinds of ramifications, and I should think we would all be afraid of that route. But they're making the point that as long as not enough of us are actually willing to stand up or lie down or whatever it is to change things, then the options are becoming less and less for people who wish to bring change. So I'd really like your comments on that, please.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm no better a political strategist than I am a theologian or anything else. But it always strikes me. I mean, my quarrel with their approach with sort of violence against property and so on and so forth is that it rarely makes sense to attack an adversary using the weapons with which they have a lot. Okay, that the minute you get into the realm of destroying things, well, I mean, you're up against the, if there's anything that our governments and things are good at, it's destruction. I mean, that's where, we've invested a lot of time and talent and everything else in getting good at that. And my guess is we're not going to win. In fact, that kind of work, that kind of stuff feeds into precisely where power structures would like us to be. And the essential gospel, the political strategy of the gospel that by passive resistance, turning the other cheek, nonviolent resistance, you heap coals on the head of your adversary, as Jesus said, is, I think, a very striking and powerful piece of political understanding, and much more savvy. But it requires you being willing to do that, okay? So if people aren't willing to go do things like get arrested and stuff, then it probably, not good. Now, having said that, I think one of the other things, and this may be a carryover of my Methodist upbringing, one of the things that's really important if you're going to do that kind of work, which some of you may feel called to, I think, is to do it in a different spirit that it's been done for the last 15 or 20 years, okay? So much kind of political resistance and nonviolence and so on has been carried out by people who sort of tend towards a kind of exhibitionism as they do it, all right? Who are consciously, self-consciously radical, who are demonstrating their difference from the culture instead of their commonality with it at all times. One of the things we said when we were doing this stuff in Washington, and I was very pleased to see that it carried over into yesterday's mass arrests on Parliament Hill in Ottawa over this same pipeline project, was that if people wanted to come, we didn't want to see them unless they were in a jacket and tie or a dress. And the reason for that was that we wanted a way to demonstrate that we were not the radicals in this scenario, because we're not. Radicals are people who work at oil companies. Okay? If you work at an oil company, you're willing to alter the composition of the atmosphere in order to make money, all right? Nobody ever, I mean, in the United States in the 1960s, Abbie Hoffman, the great hippie, managed to freak out half the U.S. by threatening to put LSD in the water supply of one city, okay? That's, compared to what Exxon does every day, okay, that's nothing. These guys are crazy radicals. And by contrast, those of us whose main hope is to preserve a world something like the one we were born into, in both social terms, where people had some kind of neighborly relations with each other and existed in relative enough equality to know each other, and to have a planet that, you know, that where it gets cold in the south and north and is temperate in between. We're conservatives, and we need ways to demonstrate that. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to do this work, the last day of this protest in Washington, somebody who hadn't quite gotten the message showed up wearing like some kind of, I don't know, I think they were supposed to be an oiled duck, some kind of costume, but they looked sort of like a chicken or something. And just one of these people that we trained, who appeared from nowhere, and who we trained in the church the night before in the church basement to be ready, overheard this person in the chicken suit saying, well, I'm going to go line up and get arrested now. And the woman just tapped her on her chicken suit shoulder and said, not dressed like that, honey, she said. That to me was a very good sign. You know, I live in the country, so I wear a necktie to funerals mostly and weddings, all right? But if you're going to go to jail, I'd put one on too.
Right, we've got 4 minutes left. I've got a couple of hands at the front. I'm old-fashioned enough to think we should have balancing agendas. So any women want to speak next? Oh. Yes, there's one up the back.
Hi, I'm Claire Morris, studying wind energy in Glasgow. I spoke to you briefly last night just about what I'm doing and my interest in tar sands. And I suppose my main concern at the moment is a bit what someone mentioned earlier, that we're still continuing to behave in a way that's dependent on oil. We drive cars, we need heating for our homes, we need all these things. And it's all very well to be doing political activism. I really highly regard what you do. But at what point does that actually work if the people doing it are still prepared to drive cars and need oil to heat their homes? And I'm doing wind energy, and I strongly believe that we can provide a solution for electricity, but for transport, that's a long way off, and there are other things that make our society still heavily dependent on oil, and while that still stands, they still have the power over our economy, over our society, and over our lifestyles.
Sure. The question is how you're going to get change in a large enough set of people for that to make a difference, okay? And so the answer, I mean, one answer would be that everybody just, say the 100 people in here renounce the use of fossil fuel and say we're not, and that would have good effect in many ways. And I'm highly tempted to it, I must say. All I really want to do, pleasant as it is to be here, is be home in Vermont, where I live, in a house that when we built it won all kinds of prizes for being the most energy efficient house. And I mean, I can basically, if I'm a writer and don't have to go anywhere, whatever, I can basically live a zero energy life, and a very, very happy one with my neighbors, and I can work on building a local system in Vermont, and it's all good. And I've spent the last few years about 50 days a year at home. And instead, I've been out on a series of airplanes spewing carbon behind me on the theory, and I don't know whether it's a correct theory in the end or not, but the theory is that we better build this global political movement that no one else was really doing around carbon, and that if we did, we'd have more effect in a shorter period of time. So the tar sands thing is like a good idea, a good example. We're fighting this battle against this pipeline, all right? And it comes at a cost. We're telling people to converge from across the eastern United States in Washington on November 6th, and they'll be in large numbers. And even if they come in buses, you know, it'll take some energy and whatever to get them there, and so on. On the other hand, if that pipeline gets built and run, this one pipeline, every single minute it will carry enough energy, every minute for the next 50 years, to negate the carbon impact of taking a standard-sized American house and retrofitting it to make it energy efficient, okay? So we can be doing all that hard work, and this one pipeline will negate one of those houses every minute for the next 50 years. So at a certain level, these things become mathematical questions as much as anything else, and one has to figure out it's some function of how much time we have to deal with this and where the most leverage is. And for the moment, it seems to me that the leverage involves above all else trying to force political change. But if we don't get that, you know, at some point, yes, we're just all going to have to go back and hunker down in our places and do what we can. And the only problem with that is because, as we said earlier, it's a global problem. Perfecting your own household or even your own town is a relatively impotent thing to do, and it's likely to be the good you can do there, likely, unfortunately, and unfairly, to be overwhelmed by what people are doing in other places if we're not figuring out some way together to restrain carbon, which above all else is a political task, and hence, in certain ways, above all else, is a spiritual task. You know? That's the highest expression of our political life, in a sense, is the things that guide it. So I wish I had a really strong, I'm not, you know, I've spent a long time telling you I'm all the things I'm not, and clearly one of them is a political strategist. I'm a writer by nature. I'd much rather be at home in my room with my typewriter. You know, that's what I like to do. But I think we're at a moment when we're all called to do this kind of thing, but well beyond this kind of thing, to figure out how to do some really basic, disruptive kinds of public example of where we need to go.
And do you think we can actually stop the pipeline? I mean,
I think we could. I think our odds of stopping the pipeline are slim, but I think they're a hell of a lot better than they were 3 weeks ago. And I think that that's, you know, making changes always seems extraordinarily difficult and impossible until all of a sudden it's the most logical thing on earth, because you've crossed some threshold and it becomes clear to enough people what needs to happen. And then sometimes change gallops. It's inertia that's the problem, above all else. Inertia and the concentration of power and wealth in the side of fossil fuel. And so the reason that we go to jail, for instance, and do demonstrations, do all that kind of work, is because we're definitely going to lose in any calculus that's based on money, right? Because they have more of it than we're ever going to, right? Therefore, and this is where the Gospels come in extraordinarily handily, and many of our other religious traditions, there are other currencies in the world than money. And sometimes there are bodies and our spirit and our passion and creativity. And if we can figure out how to make those currencies tell, how to make them count for as much as the money that the oil companies, then some of the, in the end, look, the Gospels anyway tell a story of great illogic, that weakness is stronger than strength, okay? And we need to figure out ways to make that true, and I think we can, but I don't know.
Thank you very much. On that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to end this session. I realise there are other hands from people who want to speak. But the good news is that after the coffee break, Bill will be back and we'll have a panel, and so we'll be able to engage in further dialogue. And before we have that break, two things. One, it's half an hour. Please be back promptly at 11 o'clock so we don't overrun for lunch. And secondly, just for this of our appreciation for Bill.